Hello, I'm Ed Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabyd Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. You are free to like or dislike the video, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like. I'm going to double dip this week on my series called The Tall Tale of Jesus, and I'm going to move here into part 1.3, talking about the source documents for the life of Jesus Christ. And I'm going to talk in this part about the non-canonical Gospels, the Gospels that didn't make the New Testament canon. And I'm going to talk about these not because I'm going to necessarily refer to them very much, but I do think that they demonstrate a couple of things that we need to be advised of, that there's a sense of an understanding of these Gospels that puts some, shall we say, some doubt onto the historicity of the four that have been accepted, because the nature of how those four was accepted and why these others were rejected doesn't really have a lot to do with the fact of scholarship or the idea that the early church was very much working to recognize what was inspired by God and therefore infallible or anything of that. What they were looking for was accounts of the Gospels that basically allowed them to, have some sort of unified feeling for the life of Jesus. And the real problem that they were addressing, the problem that many of these people were addressing, was that you end up with a ton of Gospels. There were literally tens and tens of these things. I don't know how many Gospels there were. There's all kinds of different Gospels out there of Jesus Christ from this time period. A good chunk of them were written by the Gnostics. And this is where the first real problem comes in. Much of what has been rejected as far as the Gospels of Jesus Christ, the reason why so many of them were rejected is they were connected with the Gnostics. The Gnostics had a very different theological viewpoint of who Jesus was and what he was about. And so part of the choice of why certain Gospels were rejected and other ones were accepted was very much simply theology, that there was a different theology. There were certain people that have been declared heretics. The Gnostics have been declared heretics by their counterpart of the established church fairly early, and the Gnostics continued to exist, continued to believe what they believed about Jesus, and continued to produce Gospels, including ones that were just, don't get me wrong, I think the Gnostics were quite out there as far as their belief system and how they looked at God and how they looked at Jesus Christ. But what you have with the Gnostics is a theological viewpoint that the rest of the church rejected. And the established church thus picks Gospels. Part of their criteria for picking the books, the 27 books of the New Testament, has to be that they were trying to eliminate some of this Gnostic heresy as they saw it. And so many of the Gnostic Gospels, many of the Gospels are simply rejected because they have the label Gnostic in front of it. The Gnostics, believed in these levels of deity. They believed that, the physical world was evil and the spiritual world was good. Things like that. I don't really see the logic of their position either. It's just, when you look at it, it really is a theological dispute why many of these Gospels were simply just outright, dumped. When you look at some of the Gospels, some of them, are talk. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, the Gospel of Mary and Judas. These are all Gnostic Gospels that have been recently looked at, particularly the Gospel of Judas, which I think there's a good video about this by another YouTuber that I'll leave a link in the description above my head. Well, actually, leave a card above my head to link to it. But he does a really good job with the Gospel of Judas and pointing out that not everybody in these Gospels viewed Judas as a bad guy. Sometimes the story has Judas as a good guy. There's also, of course, the Jewish Christian Gospels. Part of the problem with these is, with all these other Gospels, one of the major problems is authorship. There's a lot of claim, but there's no established church tradition. And so in a sense, I spoke last time in my last video about how just because it's backed up by the tradition of the church doesn't mean that it's authoritative or it gives it any historical clout. You can establish a tradition that is very wrong. But these Gospels don't have even tradition, and so they have nothing other than somebody wrote them, and nobody really knows who or why, and they offer an alternative account to Jesus's life. There's also a ton of Gospels that deal with the childhood and infancies of Jesus. Probably, many of them probably notable. Probably my favorite one is the history of Joseph the carpenter, where you have kind of a story of Joseph, the carpenter, who becomes Jesus's earthly father. So that sort of thing. There's an infancy gospel of Thomas. There's a Syriac infancy gospel. There's many infancy gospels because it's like people became fascinated. What kind of child was Jesus, this perfect person? What kind of child would he be? And they didn't really have a lot of good accounts, so people wrote stuff. And quite frankly, a lot of this is 2nd and 3rd century, so people are they're either straight up making things up or they're taking something very small and blowing it up out of proportion. There's tons of other Gospels we have no idea. There's fragment Gospels, partial Gospels. Some of my favorites are like the Gospel of Eve. That's an interesting one. Eve comes, okay, yeah, all right. Moving right along, some reconstructed Gospels, most notably the Secret Gospel of Mark. Tons of lost Gospels that are mentioned in other writings, but we don't have a copy of them. Just huge amounts of them. Tons of fragments that have been found in Egypt of Gospels. There's a couple of modern ones. There's a modern hoax called the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, which is based on the Gospel of Thomas, where there is kind of a mention that Thomas makes of Jesus having a wife, which is a very interesting concept considering many theological viewpoints. And then, of course, there's a ton of medieval Gospels. The people in the Middle Ages did not really view Jesus's life as something so sacred that the 4 Gospels were the only ones that could write about it. Other people wrote Gospels of Jesus Christ during the Middle Ages. They used the Gospels and many of these other fragments and stuff to create their Gospels. There just is so much stuff. And then, of course, there are modern Gospels. A lot of people have tried to write Gospels of Jesus Christ, taking all this stuff into account and putting it all together. Why do I mention all of these? What is the point? I'm not going to, as I go through what I call the tall tale of Jesus, a skeptic's disharmony of the Gospels, I'm pointing out that I'm going to reject these for a lot of the same reasons the Christians reject them. There is so much doubt in almost all of these to their authenticity. The Gnostic Gospels may be a notable exception here, except the Gnostic Gospels, it's pretty clear that the Gnostics are playing fast and loose with history. They don't really care. So it's like they're more concerned with the spiritual aspects of Jesus's life, and so they kind of, hem and haw about it. And so what you have here is something that I would say creates a problem. It creates a problem because some of these Gospels are just straight up weird. They're off the chain. And others of them are just the teachings of Jesus. In fact, many of the earlier Gospels that we have questions about seem to be just the teachings of Jesus, which leads me to a theory. I think that maybe there may have been a copy of Jesus' teachings before any of the other four Gospels were written. Maybe this is what we call that mysterious Q source, which both Matthew and Luke seem to use, which almost exclusively deals with the teachings of Jesus Christ. And so this kind of leads me to my theory and what the canonical Gospels and the evidence that they provide me kind of point to. To me, I think there may have been a Jesus of Nazareth, that he was a beloved teacher, that his disciples preserved his teachings. Then someone along the line, 10, 20 years later, some people begin to ask the question, well, what was his life like? And I think what you get it with, for instance, Mark, and like I said, we'll even grant the conservatives the fact that the man John Mark is the one who wrote the Gospel of Mark with Peter over his shoulder. Okay, fine. I'll grant that. Conceded. It doesn't really change the problems, regardless of authorship. But what we have then is somebody writing down this first account of Jesus Christ and some of the things that he said and some of the things, more importantly, that he did. We're talking about a history here. And so before that, I think you may have had some quote-unquote Gospels that were nothing more than some of the teachings of this Jesus of Nazareth. And what that leads me to believe at that point, and this is a theory that has been proposed by some biblical scholars, not all, of course. There's a lot of debate about the life of Jesus Christ because the information is very questionable. My purpose for this thing is to point out to Christians who hold this as a sacred text why I no longer believe the Gospels of Jesus Christ are even remotely history at times. And part of it is the Bible's own criteria of 2 or 3 witnesses. But what the Gnostic Gospels point out to me is that the 4 Gospels that we have that are canonical, yes, from a certain standpoint, a scholarly standpoint, they're the best ones of the lot. They're the 4 that rise to the top, the cream of the crop. They have enough miracles to make Jesus a miraculous figure, but they're not completely ridiculous miracles, although some would argue that a couple of them are. At the same time, they seem to grow as you get farther and farther away from the events of Jesus. What you get is this growing legend, and things get weirder and weirder, and Jesus becomes more and more powerful, more and more, how shall we say it, the Son of God that Christianity needs him to be. And I think that's very telling because a lot of these other Gospels that are 2nd and 3rd century have Jesus Christ completely off the chain as far as power and his abilities and things like that. The 4 Gospels that we do have that are considered canonical rise above all these other non-canonical ones simply because of a process of the church eliminating the rest and keeping these 4. There is no evidence whatsoever that God reached down into any of this with divine intervention to preserve his word. There's a couple problems with it. One, why all these other Gospels? It seems like if you wanted to preserve the true history of your son, Jesus Christ, you would eliminate the other non-canonical Gospels and only preserve these 4. The other point that this points out, though, is the 4 that we do have still have some of the problems of all these other Gospels. We don't have an authorship for any of them. All 4 of them anonymous. The only thing we have there is church tradition, as I've mentioned before. But also the textual issues, the missing parts, the longer ending of Mark, for example, the woman caught in adultery in John, are all obvious additions that many, like the medieval Gospels, would do that have been rejected. But it seems to me that the medieval people that wrote the medieval Gospels also were fond of editing the 4 existing Gospels that we have, adding other stories in that they wanted, and editing words and changing things to change the meaning of the text to fit the theology of the time. The non-canonical Gospels demonstrate this fairly well. What I simply point out is the other 4 Gospels that are canonical are not immune to this same criticism in some respects, because there is additions, there is weirdness, there is ideas that might be considered theologically objectionable to some people in the church. And really, this comes down to a fight between various groups of people that one group of people considered heretical. And so the heretics have to be expunged, and therefore, and thus the true faith rising to the top. But the problem with that is the true faith simply rises to the top because they hold a council and they decide which 27 books are going to be part of the New Testament canon. They reject the rest, including all these other gospels, particularly the Gnostic gospels. This is not a process of somebody recognizing that these four gospels are inspired. It is more of we're going to throw away all the other stuff that's obviously garbage and hold with the four gospels that are the least smelly as far as their garbage content. And that's what it really bounds to. Many of these gospels were rejected simply for theological reasons, that they're fragmentary, that their authorship is questionable. If I take some of these same criteria and apply them to the other four, there is some reason to reject the other four. And really, I think if they were really consistent in their criticism of all these gospels and then applied it to the other four, I'm not sure anything but Mark would survive. Mark has the least amount of problems, but it's also the one that doesn't have a birth narrative. It doesn't really have a resurrection story. It doesn't have any of that. It seems to be more of a beginning of a tall tale, of a legend, moving Jesus Christ from simply a teacher, a rabbi in that world, to a man who might be more akin to Hercules and Achilles and people like that, somebody with power, somebody that was touched by the divine, but not necessarily the Son of God in the Trinitarian sense. And that's something that needs to be considered. In the end, what the non-canonical gospels point us to mostly is that the reason that they are rejected and the reason the other ones are accepted is purely theological viewpoint. The others, most of them, are simply presenting theology that is unacceptable to the established church. In short, what you see with the canonization process is a group of people in the established church basically creating reasons to reject other gospels because it calls their already pre-existent ideas about God into question. And that is really the real story of the councils that canonized the Bible over time. That process is mostly a bunch of bishops making lists of what they consider the canonical books. And then later on, the councils basically said, yeah, we agree with that. But why did these bishops do that? Well, they were trying to find the books that supported their position and thus be able to attack the other positions as heretical and not biblical. That's why they did it. And yeah, it's more about a political fight between two groups of people that had different viewpoints on God. It has very little to do with people going forward and saying, oh yes, we can recognize that these are inspired by God because they have God's fingerprints, all of them. It's more of, yeah, this gospel presents this idea which we in the established church have rejected, so therefore this one can't be included. I know that this sounds very harsh, but you need to understand that there's nothing really special about the four gospels other than they have been recognized by the church as being the authoritative life of Jesus. So that is why I'm going to take them on and basically ignore the rest of these. Much could be said about how confusing the life of Christ would be if we included all these other gospels, but it's really unnecessary for me to do what I'm going to do, which is to show that what the Gospels really demonstrate is a tall tale of Jesus of Nazareth growing over time. I don't need all these other Gospels to do that. I just need the four that have been accepted by the church. So I only mention these as to say why I'm not going to deal with them. If I had to deal with all of these, also this series would get much, much longer. Instead, what I'm going to do is take the four that I have accepted and that the church has accepted, because that way I can at least say, okay, well, let's talk about the same text that you agreed are canonical, and I will accept as canonical. And then I'm going to demonstrate how they are conflictory, don't have 2 or 3 witnesses to back them up, and in fact are questionable in a lot of regards. But I'm also going to examine the theology of them, because I think a lot of people think that their theology of Jesus is very safe by sticking with these 4 Gospels. And I'm going to point out that that's not necessarily true, that some of the events of Jesus Christ's life, as represented in these 4 Gospels, well, they actually call into question Jesus' divinity at times. And various texts are going to have problematic implications for what you believe about God, about Christ, and even the Holy Spirit. I want to thank you for coming by, and once again, welcome to my channel. Just a reminder, comments have a way of influencing and determining the content of Friday's videos, and I will respond to them when I can. You can also ask any direct question at any time if you're looking to understand something. And you can always suggest what you'd like to see me do. Videos are uploaded usually Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. This one will be a notable exception, being uploaded Thursday, because I just did not have the time to do the research I wanted to do. One thing I won't tolerate in my comment section is name calling. You're fully welcome to demonstrate that somebody's idea is stupid. Just don't call them personally stupid. You're welcome to argue and discuss things. Just don't make it personal. People are struggling and going through and coming to different understandings. If you're an honest, genuine seeker, this rule should never be a problem to you, because you'll have to acknowledge that maybe your viewpoint is wrong. I'm constantly reminding myself that some of my viewpoints could be wrong. They're constantly being refined as I learn new things. And so just, be mindful of that. Just be understanding of that. Be sure to like, subscribe, and get your notification bell the way you want it to be. And hopefully I can someday convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, this is Rabyd, also known as the Rabid Atheist, wishing you a good day and saying goodbye.